All right, we're going to continue on chapter 6 right now, and we're going to move into the section of the chapter that talks about how to control page layout with your CSS. And one thing that you have to think about before you start building a page is the layout of your page and how it's structured. And now that seems, okay, kind of like a no-brainer, right? And really, it's like, oh, well, I'll just do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, and it'll be in this order, and it'll look just the way I want it to, right? And for the most part, we've been kind of working off of this sort of a format here, where basically we have a header and a nav and a main and a footer, and it all sits inside of a wrapper, and it's one above the other, and we're building our page, right? And that's kind of the technique we've used so far. But that's not always the approach that works best for design. You might want to achieve a different effect. So here's an example of a wireframe on the right-hand side that shows a different approach. And this is actually more of an old school approach. This is the way we used to kind of intentionally try to lay out our websites. We like the navigation on the left. It's this modern era where we put it on the top. Right now I was kind of teased about that, but it was a different approach, and not that one is right or wrong, but you know, conventions formed for a reason. But what if you did want a layout like this? Now the techniques that we just learned in the previous video, right, where we were floating things left and right, that might help you to achieve this type of an effect. So it takes a little bit of planning to do that. I mean, clearly you would have two separate components. We use divs, but this is a nav and this is a main. They're both basically generic elements that just hold things, but we would apply those same techniques. So we would have to calculate how wide we need the nav, how much spacing we want in between, how big the main should be relative to that. Should they both float left, or should one float left and one float right? Should one of them dynamically adjust to the size of the screen? Are they fixed sizes? You see all the different questions you might need to ask yourself. And there's no clear-cut answer, frankly. Really, the answer is the one I typically give to most situations, which is it depends. What are you trying to achieve is really kind of the question. All right, but if you're to look at this form of a layout, they give you the basic structure of the code and how it's laid out. Notice that it's in sequential order, just like you would expect if you were doing this, right? You would have the same code structure. It's all in the CSS as to how it lays on the page. So one thing that we could do is we could copy that and build off of it, and then start to apply some CSS. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm going to build a brand new page. So I'm going to come up to my code editor here, and I'm actually, probably more intelligently going to go to my folder, and I created a folder for box model demo. I'm just going to create a new folder now and call this one page layout. And anticipating I'll probably do more than one of them, I'll call it page layout 1. And then the other thing I will do is over on this side, try to figure out how to navigate this thing. All right, maybe that would be a smart way to do it, close all files. So you can see I'm no expert with this piece of software. I guess I'll just be simple here. I'll do open folder and find the folder. Right, it's a new piece of software for me, so. All right, so now that folder is open. It is indeed empty. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file within it. And that file is going to be called layout1.html. I'm going to create another new file right away, and I'm just going to call it styles.css. So I have both files now available to me. I'm going to do a little bit of borrowing of code. No, I know this is not complete. We're going to build out the rest of it. So we need Doctype. Practice makes perfect. It does have, this editor does have IntelliSense, so it's pretty good at predicting what I'm about to do next, I have to say. Oh, we probably want to link to the style sheet, right? Well, that's not good. What else do we need here? Type. And then ultimately we need the link to the file, which is called styles. And then we need to close that. And then we need to close our head tag. All right, so that's the head section of the document. We also need to close the document properly. And then very thankfully, they even did all our CSS work for us here. And with any luck, it'll copy cleanly. It's not always the case when you're copying from rich text formats like PowerPoint or Word, even worse. All right, the paste isn't perfect, but it's not too bad. So it looks like the wrapper, which incorporates the whole body section of the page basically, that's set to 80% width. We got our margin left-right auto, which does what? Centers the page. We have to have a width and we have to set left and right to auto. Got a background color. Header's got a background color. Got a little H1, margin 0, padding 10. The nav floats left because that's what we're trying to accomplish. The width is set to 90 pixels. There's a padding of 10 pixels, making it how wide? It's 90 pixels wide, and there's padding of 10. It's how many pixels wide? 110, 10 on each left and right sides. All right. The main's got a left margin of 100. That's kind of interesting, right? Padding of 10. On the footer, we're doing a text-align center, italic text, and a background color. All right, let's go ahead and make sure that is saved. Let's take a look at this and make sure it is saved, which it is. I'm going to come back over to my file folder here and just double-click that and open it up. And it looks perfect. We didn't put any content in there. We can't see anything. But believe it or not, that page structure is present. So here's our body, our div, our header. Oh, we got some broken code here. How do I know it's broken? I got 2 header tags. All right, we got some sort of a problem here. So see that? It's not my mistake, it's the author's mistake. Yep, don't blame me, blame the other guy or gal. All right, That looks better. But notice all this stuff is empty, so that's why it looks the way it does. So if I really wanted to see it in action, I would need to add content to it. I might want to do something like H1. That could be our menu. This will be our content. This will be our footer. Is that going to really look all that much different? A little bit, because at least now you kind of have a shape, and I'm in like device emulation mode here. There we go. That's better. So even though it's truncated and small, you can see all the different page components. You can see that it's also responding. And see what's really cool about Firefox in this mode. Or this is Chrome, isn't it? Okay, this is Chrome. Never mind. They're both good products. When I'm dragging, it also shows the width of the window as I'm moving, which is helpful for doing media queries. But you can see how it's dynamically adjusting. You can see that it's got the left navigation area, the main section. It's all sitting where it's supposed to be. And that just takes a little bit of planning. That is really about the size of it. Now, in terms of the height of the page, of course, that can be controlled. But you could very simply just apply some CSS to any one of these sections. What I would, frankly, what I would do in a situation like this is these two items, the nav and the main, are sitting next to each other. I would be really tempted, if I was coding this, to actually do something like encapsulate those into one structure. That's something I might consider doing, just to give you an idea, just so I could control it. But you can also very selectively apply a size to something like the main section, where I could give it a height. And I'm just going to guess at a number. And this is a fixed height. And then you can see that it starts to occupy more of the screen. Benjamin, that's kind of like what you were working on. But you can also do things, there's also these tags that say a minimum height. And you might want to make it smaller. You can actually do minimum height, maximum height. You can make it a percentage. So you could kind of set up a range. Because if you have content that fills the area that pushes it past that point, it will get taller. But having a minimum height would help to establish at least a baseline of how tall it could be. All right. So this is the side navigation approach. If we were to look at this sort of an approach, a little bit different. You would have a little bit different code that goes with it. I guess I'm not too crazy about this approach, although this looks pretty old school too. It's all about how you lay out the document, both the tags and the CSS for it. Now, one thing that we often do when we're creating stuff like this is we'll use navigation. And I know that I've mentioned that it was a very common technique in the days of old to do your navigation using an unordered list, and you would get something that looks like this. And it's still used. Some people still like this approach. But you can also apply a little bit of CSS, notice, to get rid of the bullets and also to get rid of the underlines. So if I wanted, I could actually take this code drop it into my HTML page in the nav section instead of ASDF. So you can take a look at that. Of course, now the page layout's breaking a little bit, but you get the point. Yes? In fact, if we want to fix it, it's not that hard to fix. I would make the width maybe 140, which means I'd probably want to make this like 150, I think, for keeping in the same alignment. I could also take that same CSS that they're applying in the slideshow now the bullets have gone away. Notice that the space that the bullets occupy is still there, though. You got to kind of code around that. But that's kind of a nice effect, right? Because you still have the links. It's still a list. I have always been a big fan of getting rid of those underlines. Depends on the design. But in terms of navigation, I like to get rid of them. All right, let's move on. There's also the approach, though, of doing horizontal navigation. And if you decide to do horizontal navigation and you're deciding basically to still use an unordered list, there's some more CSS tricks that you can apply. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to actually go back to my document here. This, I think, can all stay just the way it is, but my CSS is going to need to change. And the way it's going to need to change is to get rid of that layout that I have. So some of the stuff that I did, including the float left, I'm not going to float left. I'm not going to declare a width. I also don't need that margin on the main section, because now that main section is going to go full width. And now we're going to switch that navigation to horizontal, and we're just going to borrow the code from the slide, assuming it's correct. So I'll paste it in, and then we'll talk about what it's doing. So I'm going to replace all the stuff that's here. All right, so let's talk about these styles real quick. So nav-ul refers to the unordered list that sits inside the nav. And we're saying list style type none, that gets rid of the bullet. Inside the navigation, any anchor tag, any link, will have text decoration none. That means no underlining, no bold, no italics. That, in this situation, it gets rid of the underline. Padding right gives a little bit of space to the adjacent item that follows it. So if I have a menu item this way, there's going to be some space here before the next one appears. You don't want them touching. And then the list items, when I say display inline, here's an example of a block level element that's now going to switch to being inline because I'm saying display inline. So I'm changing its default behavior of being a block, taking up the whole width of the screen. So if I did an inspect element here right now, and I found, let's do it like this, and I found those items, those list items, it was being very resistant there. Notice how they take up the whole width? Now as soon as I do the refresh, because I've saved it, they're now horizontal going across the screen. They're still list items. The one advantage to basically leaving it as a list item is this. Let me show you a little thing that can happen. What if your style sheet breaks? Uh-oh, right? Still looks like a menu. That's the one reason people do like to use it in that capacity. I don't always feel obliged to use it in that capacity, but that's one of the reasons. So I am going to correct that. No fears. All right, back to the slideshow. All right, here's another thing that we really haven't talked about is something that we call pseudo classes. And in this case, we're using a very primitive form of it to help style our links and to give our links a certain type of behavior. Typically, when you go to a website, and I'm just going to probably pick one here at random, maybe the one that the students did. I don't know if I still have it up on screen somewhere. They have menu items, and apparently theirs don't have any hover effects, but all right, well that kind of blows my example a little bit, I guess. But if you look at a link and you hover over it and it changes colors, that's what some of this pertains to. So a pseudo class isn't really a class. It's attaching itself to a behavior that's kind of a pretend class. Pseudo means sort of like, basically. So whenever an anchor tag is a link, and almost all of them are links, we can actually style to that individually. Also, if it's been visited, we can style to that individually. Now that's the kind of behavior you see on a regular HTML page where a link is blue and it's underlined, and then you click on it, you've gone to the page, and now it's purple and underlined. So you can control that. The other thing that you can do is when you're hovering, you can give it a different style. When it's active, you can give it a different style, and same is true with focus. Now what focus and active are kind of weird. I think that link, visited, and hover are pretty intuitive. But focus, it says triggered when the hyperlink has focus. Focus on a page like the one that we're building, if I can find it now. Okay, there's no links here. All right, well, here we go. See the little dotted box that just popped up around the wheels logo there? How did I invoke that? I did that with my tab key. And when I press my tab key again, it'll jump to the next linkable item. Do you see that? That item now has focus. So I can actually style around that. Believe it or not, there's people that use keyboards to navigate around their computer. You can completely operate a computer without a mouse. You just have to know all the keystrokes. All right, but that's just an example of focus. Active is for when you are in the process of actually clicking but haven't let go of the mouse yet. So that's what the active pseudo class does. And I think it's kind of weird, frankly, because how many times are you just sitting there with the mouse pressed and not releasing it? Pretty much never. And very frankly, when it comes to these styles, I'm going to copy all of them into the style sheet so you can see how they behave. But I'm going to help you boil it down to something I think is a little bit more effective in the long run. So here's an example of anchor links or anchors with pseudo classes. The order in which these appear, believe it or not, is actually important. They need to be in this order to behave properly. So I'm going to save this. Let's go back to the browser. And that's not where we were looking at it, was it? Right. So we have our links. Now notice how it's changing color on hover. When I got it clicked but haven't released, of course, we're not going anywhere there. When I tab, so I can code for all those scenarios. Now, from a more practical sense, this is an approach that I use, and I encourage you guys, if you want to copy my approach, that's fine. I always think that, most anchors are already links. I really don't want to change the color of my link after it's been visited. I really don't care too much about the focus. I think having a hover effect is useful, and I think having an active is pretty useless. So when I'm styling stuff and I'm styling my links, I tend to leave it in this format. I'll style the link, just a regular anchor tag, and I'll usually just style a hover. And in terms of the effectiveness of it, I mean, you can judge for yourself. Really, it takes a little bit of playing with it. But there's the link, and you got a hover. I really don't care that it changes colors as I'm holding the mouse button down. I really don't care that it changes colors when I'm highlighting it like this. If I'm running the navigation for a website, do I care if I know that I visited a menu item or not? Well, in some cases, yes, but most of the times, no. So you can see this is why I've kind of boiled it down to just these two simple ones. But those are an example of pseudo classes, and styling your links so that people know that they're actually going somewhere, I think, is pretty important. And they're giving a demonstration here now. And the styles that were added to the style sheet relative to those anchor tags are just very simply colors. But you could put any sort of style in there you want. You could make the background color change if you want. So when I hover, instead of just doing, well, the text color changes, I could also do background color and do something hideous like red. And then when I refresh and I hover, yikes, that's the epitome of ugly right there. Real strong red with blue on top of it, no padding. Yikes, that hurts my ass. But it gives you the idea that you don't have to just react to one single thing. You can react to multiple things with your styles. All right, here's another neat little fun trick. It's kind of redundant, right? Neat little fun. All right. How about something like this? And you probably have seen this. It says header text image replacement. Have you seen that technique where you hover over something and then the image changes? Not necessarily the thing that you're working with. All right, so it says, useful when a non-web safe font must be used in the banner header logo area. So right here they're showing you that you have a font. And this is the Papyrus font. Not a particular favorite of mine, but one that people often use because it's one of the few available to them that's not like standard fonts. But it also says here, display the banner image, but also configure the text in H1 for use by search engines and assistive technologies. All right, so what they're telling you is that you can set up your text to be text. But what happens if it doesn't know how to read the font? Then you can set it up so that it replaces the text with an image. It's kind of weird. All right. Let's take a look at this link here so you get a clue as to how it's done. So take a look at this little snippet of code here where they're basically taking something and they're indenting it 100%. Really what they're doing is they're pushing it off the side of the screen. I'm not a big fan of this approach, but it does work. So they have something that by default is pushed off the edge of the screen, and then in the situation where you want it to come back, you trigger that off and it comes back. The old technique is what you see here, where they used to basically position something so far off the screen there's no way it could ever show up. Because nobody had a browser window that was 10,000 pixels wide. Now they might, honestly. I don't own one, but... All right, so this is a technique. If you want to apply it, I'm not really a big proponent of it, but you can use it. You can also position things on the screen. Play with that a little bit. But these are things that are very important in terms of how things are placed, and then what you can do to also, by placing them, break the page flow or utilize the page flow to your advantage, or completely ignore the page flow. The default position is static, meaning wherever it's supposed to show up, that's where it's going to show up. Some of you, when we were playing with backgrounds, played with this positioning property called fixed, which takes an object and keeps it on the screen in that particular spot. So in the slide that follows here, notice it says navigation stays in place when the page is scrolled. That's because we're using position fixed. So if I'm scrolling, it stays right in that spot. Can be good, can be bad. Depends on how it's used. Then we have what we call relative positioning, and what relative positioning does is relative to where it would have showed up on the page with normal page flow, you can adjust the positioning by declaring position relative and then also adding a positioning element. And you can use top, left, bottom, or right relative to where it's supposed to be and give it a pixel amount. So one example of that, and maybe this would be a better page to demonstrate it with. I got to find the code for that again. All right, so we have the image. Maybe we'll put it on the image. So the image is told to display block, and then I would say position relative, and then I'm going to say left, how many pixels from the left where it would normally be, and I'll say 150 pixels. But then I'm also going to do top and say, I don't know, 80 pixels. And once again, we're going to save it. Now we're going to go back to this page and refresh. That can be pretty effective too. And that's relative to where it should have been on the page. So the things that come before and follow still try to work with that. But this was moved and nothing else gets broken. The page still flows. Now there's a different approach. And this is one that you need to tread very lightly with. And that is position absolute. Watch what happens with position absolute. I am telling it to go from where it normally would be, left so many pixels, top so many pixels. So coming in from the left, coming down from the top. But now it's absolute, so it's not relative to where it should be. It's relative to the whole browser window. So watch what happens. Boom, we just broke a whole bunch of stuff. But notice it also has the capability of sitting on top of other things. And this can be very useful, actually, but it can also be very dangerous if you're trying to work a page flow around it, because it breaks your page flow. The neat thing is, it breaks the page flow so much that I don't have to have that image here. Heck, I could even put it outside the wrapper and save it, and guess what? It'll still appear right in the same spot. There's another component we can add to that, and I'm sure that's in the slides coming up. I'm hoping it's in the slides coming up. And actually, they're not talking about it at all, it seems. When you're using absolute positioning, there's another value you can add to the mix in the CSS, and that value is what we call the Z index. And some of you may have played with this in the past. And then you assign a number. You're supposed to go 0 to 100, but the truth is any positive or negative number will work. And I'm just going to say 1. Now, to explain what the z-index is, when we're working on our screen in the browser, let's bring up the browser, the top left corner of the browser is 0, 0. X goes across, so as we come from the left, it goes from 0 to, on my screen it would be 1600. In the Y direction, which is down, we start at 0 and move down and climb up in the numbers. So this is as Y0, maybe Y800, something like that. The Z is the third dimension, which comes forward from the screen. The z-index for all the objects on the screen by default is 0. When we start to apply absolute positioning, we start to break it. So what we can do is we can assign a z-index, and if we have a number of things that are positioned this way, we can actually layer them. We can create a layered effect. So I could say that if the z-index is 1 for my planet Earth, and then I added a planet Mars to it, and the z-index was 2, Mars would sit in front of the z-index of 1. So it can be used to help do those types of things. Another thing that you'll see absolute positioning used for quite a bit is for, like, you go to like a website where they have like ads that pop up, like newspaper sites and television sites are pretty famous for those, and they're right in front of everything. That's usually done with an absolutely positioned item. You usually have to click it to make it go away, but you know, it's got its uses and its annoyances, but it can break your page flow, so be really careful with absolute positioning. It can have some really cool uses though. One would be where you could put in navigation that sits at the top or the bottom and stays there. That can be a really good use for it. So, what's that? Hypothetically, it's only a positive number. Well, your better technique would be to display none. You know, if you're looking to script it, that would be the technique that you would employ. Okay, home stretch, folks, with the slides. All right, let's just read this real quick. They are recommending that you go ahead and try the CSS validator. They do have one. All right, you can use temporary background colors and borders to know the size and shape of the things that you're dealing with, because not always do you want borders and backgrounds, but that helps you to visualize the space on the screen. Use comments. I guess I haven't done that much in this class with CSS, but when I'm working on stuff, I very often will throw in comments, or if I decide, for example, that I want to try a different value, I might do something like was 20 pixels, tried 50 pixels. You know, I'll put in notes to myself. And very often if I'm playing with styles and I'm not sure if I want to keep them or not, I'll just wrap things with comments. I won't delete them. I will just very simply throw the comments in, remove them when I'm no longer using them, and then if I find that my site's done, I can just delete the comments then. But I very often will make edits, and I do the same thing in my HTML code, and we haven't talked about comments much, have we? No, in CSS, the commenting technique is whatever you want to be ignored, you start with a / and a star, whatever, put your content in, and then close it with a star and a /. And that turns it into a comment and it is ignored. In your HTML document, if you want to have something ignored, you do this. So bracket, exclamation, dash, dash, see the color change? And then dash, dash, close bracket. Now, I have to assume that the book at some point, and maybe it's in the next chapter or two, talks about comments, but comments are a pretty useful thing. I know that some instructors, when they teach stuff like this, insist that you put comments in your code, and I'm kind of optional with it. What I really recommend, though, is if you spend a lot of time figuring something out, and then you want to keep a note for yourself as to why it worked and why it didn't, put in a comment. Put in a comment. All right, moving on. We talked about these already, header elements, navs, mains, and footers. These are semantic HTML tags introduced with HTML5. The reason we did that, remember, is because we used to just create divs and say div ID header, div ID nav, div ID main. And then they got smart and like, why don't we just make a tag called that? And they're very important ones to use. The additional ones that we really haven't used much yet are these. And they have examples of them. So for example, aside, an aside might be a little box like this that kind of reinforces something. A section might be the whole area here, or it might just be one of these sections. An article would kind of encapsulate the whole thing. But what's really kind of interesting about the article and section and the aside, they do have special meaning when it comes to SEO. When search engines are looking through your pages, the way you structure those tags is important to that search engine. So when they're seeing an article, they're like, oh, this is an article. So we're going to index it as an article, and it'll have some special meaning, especially if inside that article you then have a heading inside the article. You go, oh, that must be the title, that type of thing. So it does have importance in that capacity. All right, some things that I kind of hope that at some point in time we can put completely behind us, but it's not the case, unfortunately. As long as we have old operating systems and old browsers, we do have to accommodate for them. So older machines that have no support, or older browsers that have no support for HTML5, in order to make any of those new structural elements appear, you have to add this to your CSS. So if you think that your audience might be looking at this with a browser that's older, a real safe thing to do is find those newer HTML5 elements, the ones that we were just pointing out, list them with commas in between, and then just say display block. And it will show up on the page even if it's a non-HTML5 browser. It forces it to display. The other thing that you might choose to do is to throw in a little bit of code, and notice what they call this. It's HTML5 shim, or shiv, some people call it. And basically what this is code that is only readable by Internet Explorer. It comes in the form of a comment. So you see it's got the exclamation dash dash like I did before. So what that does is the browser basically ignores it. It doesn't render it as code. But it does have a little directive here that says if less than IE9, so if it's older than Internet Explorer 9, it will connect to this script, which is some JavaScript, which runs and makes it behave in a fashion that allows it to render HTML5. So that's a technique you can use. You can grab this code and throw it on any page, and it'll be fine. Once again, I'm not a huge fan of using that technique. I'd be much more apt to write a piece of code that says, you're still using that old browser, get with the program. But the polite thing to do is something like this. There's other techniques you can employ as well, but that's a pretty handy one. All right, so yeah, you're right. It has to be at the top, no matter what. Excellent. That's an excellent question. So if you're in a scenario like that, the way that CSS works is it reads from top down. So if you say display block up on top, and then down below you say display inline, it's whatever it reads last. Yes. That's exactly correct. And what's interesting about that, Brian, is not only does it make that happen, but it gives you the capability to actually invent your own tags and have them render. That's a byproduct of XML. So that's kind of an interesting byproduct of that. So I shouldn't tell you that you can invent your own tags, but you actually can. Thank you, HTML5. Here's another interesting thing you might want to take note of. That thing that we were doing, or just looking at, this technique, is called a reset. And there's pages you can go to. Okay, well, this one doesn't show it. I want to actually show the code for it. This one's giving the rationale for it. Why do we have Yahoo? All right, here's the one I'm looking for. This is the one this is kind of like the guy that started it, really. And notice part of what he does is he takes all the new HTML5 elements right here. And notice it's the same tags, and he forces them to display. But there's also some other things that he does in his reset. And basically what he does, he takes all the tags, clears margin padding and border, amongst other things, and wipes the slate clean. It gets rid of all the styles that are built in automatically, giving you a clean slate for design. It's kind of like pointing a gun at your foot, though. You got to be careful with that, because when you wipe away all the styles, you're wiping away all the styles, so you have to put them all back. That may or may not be what you want, so you got to be careful with that. But that accommodation for older browsers is important. All right, talk about classes and IDs. Remember, in CSS, the dot precedes a class, the pound sign precedes an ID. Any native tags don't need it to be prefaced with any of that. And that's about all we're going to say, and I think this chapter is done. This is what we learned. We are going to end the video here. We're going to take another break, and then we're going to come back and do some coding.